Well, all right, y'all, welcome back. This is going to be lecture 12 on Venezuela. Um, we've hit a lot of the basics of the history, economic, society of Latin America. So these remaining chapters are going to get a little, or lectures are going to get a little shorter and shorter. So I'll have these lectures up today, and then I'll have the final assignment and the third assignment ready to go. All right, so we'll talk about Venezuela. As we all know, Venezuela is in real trouble. Um, Also, I would like to mention I realize that this book is about 6 years out of date, uh, but it's also free, right? And so you have to sort of make a balance. And I try as hard as I can to make all of my resources absolutely 100% free. And so, sometimes you lose a little bit of time, but I also didn't want you to have to go out and spend $100 to $140 for a brand new textbook. So, I guess I should just sort of explain why this is 6 years behind. And for the project, I think one of the questions this week will be on update, where are we for one of these states or a couple of these states. Okay, back to it. Venezuela. So Venezuela's had basically two opposing political cultures since the mid 90s. You've got the Chavismos. These are the people who sort of follow the former Hugo Chavez and now Nicolas Maduro. Uh, they are leftists, socialists, if not communists. They have updated some of the sort of socialist philosophy, of course, for the modern day, but they are very, very much the new hard left in Latin America. And so, yeah, socialist in orientation. They came in, and when Chavez was elected, they nationalized a lot of industries. They sort of bloated their bureaucracy once again and filled it with cronies, as we've talked about. They started to really build up their military apparatus and gave powerful control to the president over the military. Um, we've also had a lot of sort of ups and downs on oil prices with Venezuela, right? Venezuela really rides the oil roller coaster because it's their main export. Um, Much of their entire economy is based on oil, right? Okay, and they're very, very anti-democratic, right? And so, you saw Hugo Chavez change a lot of the electoral rules, and then Maduro came in and arguably lost the last election badly that he held, I think it was last year or earlier this year, and had his cronies in the court say it was unjust and that the elections didn't count and he's still the leader. So, um, I don't think he has any intention of having real democracy. The problem with the opposition is that it's really fragmented. It's highly diverse. The only thing that really holds them together is that they want their democracy back, right? Okay. I would also mention that in this particular chapter, the author takes this weird sort of cultural rather than institutional approach, even though he does take an institutional approach at the end. I'm much more familiar with the institutional sort of stuff. That's what I came up in grad school with. But we'll go through some of this sort of cultural approach that he takes. So, first, he says we got to frame the political context. So, we got to remember that the dictatorship of Perez Jimenez is overthrown, and basically they put together this coalition called the Pacto Punto Fijo, and three main parties emerge, and the communists are basically disallowed from participating. So the first party is the Democratic Action, the AD. The second is the Christian Democrats, the COPE is what they call them. And then the third is the Democratic Republican Union, right? All Democratic, all sort of center or right wing parties pushing back against sort of the leftist dictatorship of Perez Jimenez. So basically, the three parties promised that they would share the executive and economic power in the state, and they even sort of let the Catholic Church have a big role in governing and in education, especially. And for quite a while, oil was a huge commodity, right, with really high prices. And so it allowed for some pretty good times. And so they were able to export a lot of oil. They had high prices. This allowed them to borrow a lot on the promise of future oil sales, right? And they built this bloated bureaucracy, as we've seen under sort of ISI projects. Unfortunately, as we know, oil turned sour, right, in the late 70s and early 80s. And the state in Venezuela basically begins to completely collapse. By the late 80s, early 90s, there's complete political chaos. It's still a democracy, but they're rolling in and out of presidents. Nobody really knows what to do. Hugo Chavez, who is the lieutenant general or a lieutenant colonel, um, fails a coup in 92. He is jailed, but the next president in 94 pardons him, and then he becomes this huge political star basically in Venezuela. He's elected president in 1998, and then things start to sort of turn weird, right? Uh, I skipped section 2B, section 2C, defining group boundaries. The only things I really wanted to say here is, the PSUV, which is the Chavistas, which is sort of the left wing Communist Party under Chavez and Maduro. All the government positions basically are now held by these people. Um, if you're not a member of the PSUV, right, that means that the state can deny you services. Like you can be denied health care, you could be denied food stamp benefits, you could be denied all of these sorts of things. So it's almost like forced party membership, right? It's all. I mean, it's basically a one party state with repressed opposition groups. Section 2D, interpreting the actions and motives of others. Here I would present that this has been sort of a turn with a lot of political movements in recent times. This sort of victimhood presentation, right? So we've seen it in America with both parties at times. We definitely saw it under the sort of Jair Bolsonaro regime. We've seen it under some of the Nicaragua and Honduras. We saw it in Venezuela, where the PSUV and the Chavistas are portraying themselves as the victims of the Punto Fijo agreement. That all of the corruption under Punto Fijo and the theft of the oil money means that sort of democracy can't function correctly, and that only the Chavistas should be running things. Excuse me, I'm sorry. Um, and finally, that the Punto Fijo government was sort of an imperialist puppet of the United States, right? So that's been a big turn in South America too. Not that they don't have a bit of a point, but it has been sort of one of the rallying cries of why a lot of South American, Latin American countries are moving away from the United States and trying to sort of go their own way, as we talked about with Brazil, Argentina, and others. Okay, section 3. Yeah, there was a screw up in section 3A, historical and political economy. He mentions that there's three parties and the communists were one of them under Punto Fijo. It's not true. I just wanted to point that out, that they really screwed up this chapter. This chapter was a little frustrating. Um, the petroleum roller coaster and institutional stress. Okay, so we were talking about that. Like it goes up and down in Venezuela and in a lot of these sort of extractive economy states. So um, in 1957, Marcos Perez Jimenez takes over by military coup. At that point, gas prices were collapsing, right? Finally, gas prices are also collapsing in the 80s. So Perez takes over. He rules, the military rules for 30 years or so. Finally, oil prices start to collapse again. They're under incredible debt in 1988. And so in 1988, the military steps down. Carlos Andres Perez becomes the president. Um, Again, I mean, it's just an economic disaster, which is kind of the tale that we've been talking about in Latin America. Is when there's an economic disaster, You get complete reversals of regimes. You get military takeovers. You get returns to democracy. It's pretty wild there sometimes. And so there's collapsing oil prices. Um, Perez drops price controls. Inflation goes through the roof, right? Because they were saying, okay, you can have bread for whatever dollar, and they turn that off because the state could no longer subsidize the price of food. And so inflation, like I said, kicks in. There's rioting all over Venezuela, especially in Caracas. 300 die in late 1989. Um, and then Andres Perez, things actually start to, excuse me, in 1988, Andres Perez steps in. He institutes neoliberalism, as we've talked about before, the Washington Consensus, and the economy starts to do pretty well in the 90s, right? Um, but things are still chaotic. In '92, like I said, Chavez tries to take over. He's imprisoned. Uh, but everyone in the country basically thinks that the government is corrupt, that Chavez probably did the right thing, even though he went about it the wrong way. There's another coup later that year. And then again, Andres Perez is indicted on corruption charges, and the Senate kicks him out basically, and it's just chaos, right? And so the government is collapsing, inflation is kicking in, and so then this sort of Bolivarian champion, Hugo Chavez, steps in 1998. He is elected president. He immediately, on day one, calls for a new constitution to rewrite the constitution, right? And so he puts a whole bunch of leftists on a committee and pass a new constitution in 1999. He starts to really tear down all these new neoliberal policies in 2000 and 2001. The opposition tries a coup against him. It works for like 5 hours and then fails. Chavez comes back. He holds a referendum. The voters elect him in even higher than they had before. And so he's like, okay, I'm going to try to push this new constitution in. He banishes term limits. Um, he tries to expand Social Security. He tries to take over the central bank, which is really touchy, right? He calls for land redistribution policies, but the referendum fails, right? And oil prices start to collapse because of the crash of 2008, where the American and European banks were just collapsing left and right. But he manages to hold on to power, and then he actually gets some of those reforms pushed in. And he even starts to sort of establish communes all over Venezuela that take over instead of regional or municipal government. Okay, we should talk about. He does die. He dies in 2014. Maduro is elected president. Maduro has been really tied to the military. He's been, uh, a relatively like fascist kind of leader, very hard nosed. He's killed many protesters, imprisoned, tortured. There's no free media. This, I cannot remember her name right now, but this woman was running for president against him. He had the Supreme Court declare that she was somehow, not fit to run. So she backed this other guy from out of nowhere, and he beat Maduro, like clearly handed him his ass. Um, but they shut down the elections, and Maduro's still the leader. So it's pretty messy right now. Okay, we should talk about their interest group. So the military have been basically bought off, taken control of, and stuffed with loyalists since 2005. Um, after the failed sort of putsch or coup of 2005, um, basically Chavez said, "All right, we got to tear down the military and fill it with loyalists." Um, Another powerful piece of Venezuela is the church. It has been rather lenient, I would say, on Chavez and Maduro. And they've sort of taken a pretty neutral stance on all of this. They often play the interlocutor when any sort of mediation comes up with the OAS, the Organization of American States, when there's regional discussions with Brazil, Argentina, Colombia, others, um, and when there's discussions about democracy, human rights abuses, and the mass immigration that is happening in Venezuela. Venezuelans are flooding out of their country, not only headed for the U.S. but also, Brazil, Uruguay, lots of neighboring countries, Colombia, etc. The unions uh, used to be pretty powerful, but Chavez and Maduro have basically made them illegal and created their own sort of union. So they've basically just crushed the power of the former unions. Their real strength is among the poor, right? So they instituted what's called the Misiones Project. And so this is like on the ground help in the slums that brings healthcare, schooling, job training, social security benefits, child care benefits, food handouts, and subsidized food um, to the very poorest people of Venezuela. And so that's what's really his popular base. Okay, let's see. Their constitution's a little weird. It says they have five branches of government, right? The normal three: executive, legislative, judicial. But they also claim to have an electoral branch, so that's supposed to be in charge of all the elections. That has been just basically a way to control the elections. And then they also have the fifth branch of government, the people power branch, which I find a little bit silly and just, propagandist, I guess. But, this is supposed to be an ombudsman or sort of a government watchdog commission that doesn't really function like that. Okay. The presidency is elected for 6 year terms. Like I said, the elections don't really matter anymore. They have plurality elections. Again, these are not legitimate. They have a bicameral legislation. You can get legislation from 7 different sources, which I found to be like really messy, right? The president, the Delegative Commission of the National Assembly, which is like the lower house, any 3 members of the lower house, the Supreme Tribunal of Justice, like the Supreme Court, can introduce laws, which is very strange. The electoral power, which I need to study more upon, the citizen power, so that one I was talking about earlier, and then also by petition. So if you get 0.01% of the population to sign a petition, they can enter a law in for discussion. Right, a lot of stuff. The president has a whole crapload of power, right? He can call for new elections at any time. Um, he can write his own legislation. The legislature has very little power and is mostly guaranteed to be stuffed with chavistas, right? The judicial branch has also basically crumbled in contemporary times in Venezuela. The Supreme Court, the Supreme Justice Tribunal, is the highest court, but again, it's also stuffed with cronies and loyalists. Um, even one time under Chavez, like they accidentally had this election where the opponents won. He stayed in power, and the Supreme Court, this Supreme Judicial Tribunal, said, "Well, they're illegitimate, so they can't really legislate. No legislation can come out until there's a new election." So, that kind of wild, ridiculous stuff. Let's see. Do do do. Oh yeah, I guess we could talk about their economic development policy. It's been very troubling for the West. The West, of course, likes the Washington Consensus, neoliberalism. But when Chavez came in, he nationalized the oil companies completely, and a lot of other industries. Most of the major extractive industries, most of the hospitals, most of the schools, all of the oil companies, etc. Uh, the oil industry actually tried to fight him, right? And he fired 20,000 people. It was like 13,000 regular workers, 6,000 executives. You're all fired by executive decree. And he just completely filled it up with cronies and started handing out jobs to win political support. Uh, Unfortunately, that meant that their company became pretty left behind, I guess I would say. So when you have people who don't know what they're doing and are political hacks running things, things tend to get inefficient and you don't really know how to work it. They've got decades old technology because they haven't really invested in it and they can't keep up with the new technology anyway because they're not trained for it. And their oil is kind of dirty. It's a crude, it's a poor quality crude oil. So it's not even worth as much as like a clean barrel of oil on the market. And given the gas is dropping, like they're in more and more trouble every day, right? As long as oil prices are low, Venezuela is suffering. Okay. Uh, I would also mention that they have an incredibly violent society. They have very, very high homicide rates. Rapes are a real problem in their society. There are severe human rights abuses by their military and police. There's murders and kidnappings by the state. There's drugs. It's not a good place to be. I guess unless you're one of like Maduro's cronies, right? Let's see, and I would say on their foreign policy, they're becoming far more bombastic. They're part of this whole new left that's sort of screaming against the U.S. We had banned their oil, but under basically under Biden, we decided that we needed oil more than we needed the moral superiority of not sanctioning them, because inflation was pretty high during COVID and post COVID. And so they wanted to open up more supply routes for oil to drop the prices. But, uh, I think it was kind of a morally irresponsible decision. But anyway, but so Venezuela has gotten away with a lot because they can sort of swing that oil thing around and say, don't mess with me. I'm a major producer. So anyway, I'm going to leave it there. Thank you so much for being here. We'll be on to Uruguay next. Have a great day.